That question of change in continuity is a big one for us, obviously, this year. So do remember what the big stick's all about, and do remember what dollar diplomacy is all about. We're mostly going to look at military interventions in this presentation. We've been talking about some of the economic stuff in class. So tomorrow, we're going to discuss what you think the United States is doing in the world in 1990, and is it the same or is it different than what the U.S. was doing in the world in 1920? We aren't really going to be taking a look at how these new countries play a role in U.S. foreign policy, but it is interesting to note that the world gets a lot more complicated when all of what you see in this slide used to be one nation, and now it's broken down into lots of nations. Usually when U.S. personnel and civilians need to be evacuated, it's because the country is in a civil war or suffering a natural disaster or dealing with some kind of civil turmoil that puts Americans at risk. In the case of Liberia, it's civil turmoil. This map is going to become pretty familiar. So 1990, we have Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Desert Saber, all of those related to getting the country of Iraq out of the country of Kuwait. After the war, the U.S. leaves troops in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia to keep an eye on Saddam and what he's doing in Iraq. Iraq then has to deal with a whole lot of turbulence because of Kurdish rebels who are mostly located in the northern part of the country. And then in the actual country itself, there's a massive amount of unrest along religious lines between Shia and Sunni Muslims. With the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War, the country known as Yugoslavia essentially breaks up into its component parts of Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Macedonia. If you remember from world history, which you'll talk a lot more about next year, the Serbs are the ones who helped trigger World War I when Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated visiting the country and the capital city of Sarajevo. But you'll get more on that next year. In the meantime, in the 1990s, as you're going to see, this becomes a big mess. We talked about what happened in Somalia in class and actually showed you the presentation, but there in the arrow is a link to that presentation in case you would like to go back to it and indulge your curiosity further. The Clinton doctrine, unlike the Truman doctrine, doesn't really ever get written down. Instead, it's articulated in a series of speeches that Clinton and his national security apparatus articulate. So I'm pulling these quotes from multiple different places. In a lot of ways, what's interesting is that this is a reverse domino theory. Wherever communism has collapsed, capitalism and democracy will spring up, and so the United States is no longer acting to contain communism or eradicate communism. Now it's looking to replace communism. So what Clinton is looking to do here is essentially say the United States is going to intervene in countries to help foster democracy, capitalism, and to alleviate suffering. So that asterisk is definitely there because this is a so far. We haven't seen this happen. The hot hand fallacy says that just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's never going to happen. And that's a fallacy because just because something has been true in the past doesn't make it likely in the future. So just because a basketball player has made his last 4 shots doesn't mean he's going to make his next one. The United States begins to operate through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Here, NATO is flying a no-fly zone over Bosnia to aid UN peacekeepers that are on the ground. Serbs begin attacking the UN forces, taking them hostage and using them as human shields while attempting to shoot down NATO planes, and they do have some success with that. So this mission actually changes from a no-fly zone to a bombing campaign against the Serbian military as a result of the Serbs' actions. The United States military occupies Haiti after there's a military coup which deposed the democratically elected President Jean-Bertrand Aristide. The UN gave approval to this effort. Jimmy Carter, Sam Nunn, and Colin Powell all go to Haiti. They negotiate with the coup leaders to step down peacefully on the eve of the U.S. invasion. The U.S. military was in the air and in the water and heading toward Haiti. So ultimately, when the country is occupied, it is largely peaceful. There's not a lot of shooting. U.S. soldiers then remain to make sure Aristide remains in power, and then the U.S. military departs in 1995. Desert Fox is an interesting activity. It is the United States and Great Britain working together to conduct a 4-day bombing campaign in Iraq because Iraq was not complying with UN inspectors who were there to investigate Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, you'll hear that a lot later, capabilities. So this means biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. The targets of the bombing were the areas that were suspected of storing, creating, and developing those weapons. So it was a widespread campaign. It lasts 4 days. It does a huge amount of infrastructure damage to Iraq and generates a lot of ill will because a lot of those suspected facilities weren't actually facilities. We're going to come back to these bombings in a little bit greater detail when we start talking about September 11th. But if you remember, the World Trade Center bombing happened in the early part of the decade. Then we get the embassy bombings. They are bombed in exactly the same way as the Marine barracks in Beirut were bombed. A large truck, suicide driver, drives right in, detonates. It can also be seen as very similar to the way Oklahoma City and that bombing of the Murrah building went down. So there's a repeated pattern here, and Al Qaeda is essentially probing the United States to see what the response is going to be. And the response was not to put troops on the ground, but to use remote control to bomb from a distance. And so actually, we end up missing bin Laden in Afghanistan by about 5 minutes. If the missile had landed 5 minutes earlier, bin Laden would have been killed. The building that he was in was utterly destroyed, and it did kill several of his subordinates in Al Qaeda, but a missed opportunity there. Allied force was a large-scale, NATO-led, high-altitude bombing of Kosovo, um, going after Serbian military positions, infrastructure, and communications locations. This also resulted in the so-called accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy. The Chinese government was helping the Serbs with their communications through their embassy building. So the United States blew it up, killed 4 Chinese nationals, did about $2 million worth of damage, and then apologized to China, claiming that it was an accident and blaming old CIA maps for not knowing that that was where the embassy was. It was a pretty transparent message to the Chinese government to get out of this information sharing business, and the Chinese government got the message, but it definitely put U.S. China relations into a little bit of a deep freeze for a while. So this is a mess, and clearly it keeps coming around. The United States decides that the former Yugoslavia and its unrest is a priority for NATO, but we, as the kind of primary driver of NATO, need to get involved in order to keep Europe stable. The fear is that if this area becomes totally chaotic and unstable, it's going to spill out and spiral into the larger part of Europe. And so the United States says this is in our interest to get involved with. I'm not sure. It's still a bit of a mess there today. But let's talk a little bit about what was going on that caused the United States to get involved. The phrase ethnic cleansing does not mean the same as genocide in international relations. It's a fine line. I'm not going to get into it. But you should know that if the word genocide is used, there are automatic parts of the UN Charter that come into effect. And so the United Nations generally does not like to use the word genocide, nor does the United States government, because it essentially legally obligates both bodies to respond in a certain way. So by calling it ethnic cleansing, we are able to sidestep obligation. So that tells you a lot about how determined people were to protect various ethnic groups and minorities in the 1990s. Honestly, most Americans couldn't find any of these places on a map. Many of them don't care. The 1990s as the United States gets deeper and deeper into this particular mess, more and more Americans begin to become concerned. Clinton, in the wake of what happened in Somalia, does not want to commit ground troops to any of it. He's happy to do bombing. He's happy to do airstrikes. He's happy to keep American troops from being on the ground and dying in the midst of this conflict. So America doesn't put boots on the ground, and the conflict kind of drags on. It's also worth noting that no other member of NATO really is excited to get involved with this conflict either. So it's not just the United States that's feeling timid about the possibility of their soldiers being killed in the midst of a very confusing ethnic conflict in a former communist country. This was something that Clinton actually did go and apologize for afterward. A lot of very valid criticism was leveled at the Clinton administration for not getting involved in this bit of ethnic cleansing that was really a genocide. So a lot of questions are raised. Why does the United States care about white Europeans killing each other and not care about black Africans killing each other? And I think if you think about it, you can probably come up with some good reasons for that. We're going to talk about some of Clinton's domestic policies revolving around African Americans, and you can see a pretty clear through line of racism in the United States government's response and non-response to various genocides. This was horrible. You'll talk more about this in world history too, but this was just an atrocity. And I personally believe the United States should have gotten involved. But the UN didn't do anything. The US didn't do anything. Rwandans have done a remarkable job of healing after this, and there's a lot of really great stuff about humanity that happens in the aftermath of one of the worst sides of humanity. So I guess that's some hopefulness there. But that's it. So your task now, thinking about what everything that you just saw and heard. We're going to talk tomorrow a little bit about, is this consistent with United States intervention throughout the 20th century? What's changed about it? What stayed the same about it? And what lessons can we take as we head into the 21st century from Bill Clinton's choices in the 1990s as he looks abroad?